Hi, my name is Heather Edgar, and I'm going to be presenting this talk, Development Challenges and Applications of the New Mexico Decedent Image Database. First, let me give you a little background on the database that I'll be talking about. The database was developed at the Office of the Medical Investigator in New Mexico. This office, as a medical examiner's office, is unusual in that it is statewide, centralized, and academically based. And for that reason, because it is statewide, the ethnicity and racial diversity reflects that of the state of New Mexico. And the reason that this database exists starts with the fact that in 2010, the OMI moved to a new facility that included capabilities of CT and MRI. In 2010, long before I was at the Office of the Medical Investigator, researchers there received a grant from the NIJ to test whether CT could supplement or supplant traditional autopsies in very specific causes and manners of death: gunshot wound, sharp force, and shaken baby syndrome. However, the decision was made not just to scan for cases where those were thought to be the case, but in fact to scan everybody, basically not to miss those cases, and because they were already hiring a CT tech. So scanning from 2010 to 2017 resulted in more than 15,000 CT scans that were all stored. However, there was no plan at the time for the reuse of the images. They were collected for medical legal investigation and nothing else. Part of the reason that this lack of planning, or this lack of thinking about how it might be used for other research, it leads to a lot of problems with the way that the data was set up. First of all, there was a single database that included text fields and few standards that described the individuals. So, this is our investigative database. So it included things like, was the person male or female? And those were the choices that were given, male or female. However, even though that was a limited set of choices, it was a text field. And so you could have male, female, male with capital M, female with capital F, just M, just F, and a variety of different things. And that makes using that kind of data very difficult. And many other fields were this non-standardized format. At the same time, you have the CTs, which are in a standardized format, but they are not associated with kind of searchable information that you might want. So you could not search among the CTs to find everybody who died of gunshot wound. That was in the other database that was non-standardized. So we determined that you can't search images, but that we could recreate the data into a database that included searchable metadata of interest to researchers. In 2016, we received a grant from the NIJ to develop and share the database, and that's what's now called the New Mexico Decedent Image Database. That involved the creation of data and vocabulary standards. Fortunately, my co-author on this paper, Dr. Berry, is a biomedical informaticist. We received metadata from two sources: that OMI database that I mentioned previously, which needed all kinds of crazy cleaning and standardization. But we also determined to call next of kin for additional information about family members. Then we developed a website interface that provides the metadata and allows CTs to be downloaded to researchers. We purchased 85 terabytes of secure data storage. We're fortunate that we actually used just a little bit over 50 terabytes, and so that gives us some room to grow. Now, talking about those images, one whole body CT dataset consists of about 10,000 2D images, which can be displayed as either individual 2D images or reconstructed into 3D renderings. Each individual of the more than 15,000 totals about 7 gigabytes of data. The data sets that are downloadable consist of two sets of images. One are optimized for displaying soft tissue, and the other for displaying bone. We also provide users with images called scout images. or sometimes they're called thumbnails. These are available to the end user on the decedent metadata website. And this is really useful, so you can get a quick idea. They're kind of like whole body x-rays, and it gives you a quick idea of what the individual's body looks like, so you can make kind of a rough estimate of whether this individual will work for your research. The data is provided as DICOM images. However, DICOM usually includes, like if you went to the hospital and you got a CT made, it would include a lot of private information like your name, your birth date, a patient number, and all those kinds of things. So we completely de-identified all of the DICOM images, all 10,000 per person. And then we anonymize them, creating a new letter that links them all together, a code that links them all together and links them with metadata. The CT images were originally required using a Philips Brilliance Big Core 16-slice CT scanner. They are at a slice width of 1 millimeter with 0.05 millimeter overlaps. Now, these are not isometric voxels, which means that they are 1 millimeter in one direction, 1 millimeter in another direction, and about 1.5 millimeters in a third direction. And as I mentioned, images are optimized for soft tissue and bone. So you can, set your Hounsfield units that you're interested in and look at skin, kidneys, bones, whatever is of your interest to you. Let's talk a little bit about the metadata that's available. So this is a very overall description of what's available. We have the basic census information, including sex and gender. I guess that's not census information, but we did ask that question of next of kin. Zip code is provided to just the first 3 digits to protect privacy, and a lot of other kinds of things, birth weight, years in the US. We also ask ancestor birthplace, where was your mother born, where's your father born, where your grandparents born. And then we ask a lot of questions about health history. When we talk to next of kin, we ask questions about, did the individual have surgery? What kind of jobs did they have? Did they smoke? All those kinds of things. And then we have from our investigative records a lot of information about the circumstances of death, like manner of death, cadaver length, those kinds of things. Now, bone density is not yet in this database. We have hope to include that in the future. We have manner of death information for almost all individuals, 15,236. And out of that, 38, almost 39% were accident, about 35% were natural, about 7.5% were homicides, and 15.5% were suicide, and 4% are undetermined. The decedents in this database account for approximately 11% of deaths in New Mexico during the period that the data was collected, which was mid-2010 to mid-2017. We have about 2/3 males and 1/3 females, and 2/3 of the individuals show no discernible decomposition. A single radiology tech looked at all 15,000 plus CTs and scored them on a score of 0 to 3, I believe it is, on decomposition, so that if you are only interested in either decomposed or not decomposed bodies, you can have that as a choice to look at. So the age distribution is not surprisingly younger than you would have as a natural death population or sample in the state of New Mexico. Yeah, it's definitely biased towards younger individuals. And then this is the race and ethnicity codes. We used census codes, but then we also, in the investigative records, census codes are used. And then when we talked to next of kin, they could provide information about Hispanic or Latino affiliation as either race or as ethnicity. Here in New Mexico, if you ask somebody what race they are, Hispanic is going to be a very common answer. 48% of the state is Hispanic. And that's actually the word that most people use. That's much more common than Latino, Chicano, or other words. So that's why we use that word. Now, I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about ethical considerations that we worked on while we were developing this database. We had an interesting situation come up, which is that in New Mexico, decedents are not considered human subjects. So if you want to study decedents, whether they be, images or not, there is no human subjects review available for that research. All data kept by the Office of the Medical Investigator is actually discoverable through Freedom of Information Act requests. And so anybody, honestly, could have developed this database had they been so oriented. So we developed a research protocol for UNM.IRB that was not about the decedents, but instead about calling next of kin to ask them questions about the individuals in the database. However, our institutional review board determined that next of kin are not subjects of research, because even though we are asking them questions, or did ask them questions, we were not asking them any questions about themselves. We also were not specifically asking for questions that were leading directly to a publication, although we expected that publications would arise from the information. But specifically, because the next of kin were not the subjects of research, our institutional review board considered them not human subjects, considered calling them not human subjects research. So we were in a place where the decedents were not human subjects and the next of kin were not human subjects. So we determined to develop the project following the specifications of our research protocol anyway. And in that, we did our very best to protect decedents' privacy, to protect next of kin privacy, and the data use agreement that all researcher signs places limitations on the use of the data designed to protect this information and those individuals. During our calls to next of kin, all the interviewees, all the people we talked to, were informed that their participation was voluntary, that they could answer all, some, or no questions. They were provided with my name and contact information. We have at the Office of the Medical Investigator grief counselors on staff, so we offer grief counseling contact information to everyone. We also had, by the way, the students who called these people, the next of kin, also were offered grief counseling. And everyone was told that they could opt out of participation. So these are the kinds of things you would do as a requirement of a IRB protocol. So even though we didn't have an IRB protocol controlling our behavior, we acted as if we did. Many people chose not to answer some or all questions. About 30 people contacted me with questions. Most were actually asking whether the whole thing was a scam or not, but others were asking if there was more information about their family members. And I answered their questions as well as I possibly could, and directed them to other resources when needed. Only one person requested that their family members' information be removed from the database, and of course we honored that request. So there are 15,242 people in the database. In the 2 years we had for the project, 2.5 years for the project, we attempted to call 9,950 individuals. Of that, we made contact with about 5,000, the rest for people who didn't return phone calls or whose phone numbers had changed or something like that. And of that 5,000, 2,072 provided information to our surveyors. I thought this was a pretty good result. How many or what percent of individuals did vary some among groups, but maybe less than I would have expected. Among Native Americans, 15.5% of people who we contacted provided information, answered our surveyors' questions. Among Hispanic and Latinx Americans, it was about 23.5%, and among white non-Hispanics, for comparison, it was about 24% who provided information. So overall, our response rate was really high, higher than I would think for many, many surveys. And I think that that speaks to next of kin hoping that their family member's death can make a contribution. That I heard that a lot from people who asked questions, and so did our surveyors. The metadata associated with the images requires application and confirmation that the data requester is a bona fide researcher with reason to access the data. So you can get the metadata for NMDID without a huge research request, but you must be associated with a research or educational institution. All researchers, whether they're just getting metadata or images, sign a data use agreement to access that information. For images, researchers also complete a request for review of research. This describes their project, their needs, the members of the team who require access, and also describes that they must adhere to the components of the data use agreement. There are no other research databases of this size or with full body CT images of any size. This is a free access research database. And we hope that in addition to providing this resource, the data use agreement and the format that we've used will act as a blueprint for other institutions to create better products, similar products, but also better products. We hope to improve NMDID, and we hope that the next person who makes something like NMD does a better job than we did. We're good, but we could be better. One of the reasons that NMDID exists is, in my opinion, to make science easier for people to do. And it's been especially important during the COVID year. We have supported master's theses, dissertations, and education in ways that I actually personally had never expected would happen. We have so far have approved 491 users from 43 countries to access NMDID. Additionally, there have been 166 people approved for image data downloads from 28 countries. And these include countries where they're small, it's usually one or two, but there's people from Thailand, there's people from China, there's people from Peru that are accessing images in this database to conduct science. There are some user ethical considerations that I think everyone should keep in mind. First of all, because there is no human subjects that was required, there was none, excuse me, no consent that could be offered. So no consent was involved in image creation. These are decedents. Family members are not consulted for their family members' images to be made because it is part of medical legal investigation. No formal consent process for metadata collection either. We acted as if there was, as I mentioned, but we did not do a phone consent. There's also no consent involved for image sharing. There was this is an opt-out program, and as I mentioned, one user or one next of kin opted out. We rely on users' agreement not to attempt to identify individuals. We built in many privacy safeguards, but one thing we did not do was blur or remove faces. In the data use agreement, we require that people do not attempt to identify individuals or make faces public, but we are beholden on people's honesty for that. We're going to create a PDF of these very basic facts and a little story about the ethical decisions and how they were made onto our website. Actually, most of this information is already up there, but in a little survey we did recently, we found that no one is actually reading the documentation that we already provide. So for example, the research protocol that is up and no one looks at it. The CT protocol is up and people don't look at it. The videos that we've made about how to use it go on unwatched, and that's fine. People can use the database. We wanted it to be convenient and easy to use, and so that's great. But we're going to put this information up, but I'm not sure if it will make a real difference if people don't read it. I also just want to be clear that there's no requirement that anyone use NMDID for their work, and so if they are uncomfortable with the decisions that we've made, they can opt out of using NMDID. I want to thank the very large NMDID team who worked on this project. I want to thank the OMI team who saw the research potential in not just throwing away these CTs. I want to thank the next of kin who participated in our surveys. There are video tutorials, as I mentioned, available on the website. Additionally, if you want to learn how to use our CTs, there's a 4-part webinar available through the Forensic Center of Excellence. Here's our website, NMDID.UNM.EDU. And of course, I want to thank the National Institute of Justice for funding. And thank you all for your attention.